My husband Robert died on a Tuesday in March. Not dramatically, not with last words that would make a good movie. He simply became less and less of himself over the course of 2 years. The cancer doing its patient, merciless work until one morning, the breathing stopped and the room was quiet in a way it had never been before. I held his hand until it was cold. Then I drove home, made a pot of coffee. I didn't drink and sat at our kitchen table for a long time. We had been married for 41 years. I was 25 when we got married, in a small church in Knoxville, Tennessee, on a Saturday that rained all morning and cleared up just before the ceremony. Robert used to say the weather was trying to make up its mind about us and decided in our favor at the last possible minute. He was that kind of man, the kind who found the gentle joke in every hard moment. I missed him every hour of every day for the entire year that followed. Our home, a 4-bedroom colonial with a front porch, and an oak tree Robert had planted the year our son Nathan was born, became impossible. The rooms were full of him, his coffee mug in the cabinet, his boots by the back door, the particular way the morning light fell across the hallway that I had always associated with coming downstairs to find him already. In the kitchen, radio on, making eggs. I couldn't stay. Every drawer I opened was a goodbye. So I sold the house. I got a fair price, put the money in the bank, and told myself I would figure out the next chapter when I was ready. The problem was that grief doesn't work on a schedule, and readiness is a state that kept receding like the horizon, always visible, never quite reachable. That was when Nathan called. Nathan is my only child. He's 38, works in logistics management, and has been married to his wife Stephanie for 5 years. They live in a 3-bedroom house in East Chattanooga, neat and comfortable, in a neighborhood of young families and established routines. When he offered to let me move in just temporarily, just while I found my footing, I felt the particular relief of someone who has been holding themselves up by sheer will and suddenly has something to lean against. "You'll always have a place with us, Mom," he said. I remember those words exactly. I have replayed them many times since. I moved in on a Friday afternoon in May, 6 months after Robert passed. Stephanie smiled at the door and showed me to the guest room at the end of the hall, small, but clean, with a window that faced the backyard and a closet, just big enough for what I'd brought. I put Robert's photograph on the nightstand. I unpacked my 2 suitcases and my cardboard box. I told myself this is a new beginning, smaller and quieter, but still a life worth living. I tried very hard not to be a burden. I kept my things in my room. I cleaned the kitchen after every meal, whether I had cooked or not. I did laundry without being asked. I bought groceries with my own money and never kept a tally. I was careful about the television, careful about the thermostat, careful about when I went to bed and when I woke up. I had spent a lifetime managing a household, and I understood instinctively that I was now in someone else's, and that the rules were theirs to set. For the first few weeks, it was all right. Stephanie and I talked in the evenings while she cooked. Nathan would kiss my cheek before work in the mornings. Some nights, we watched old films together. Nathan had loved old movies as a boy, and still did. And those hours felt like the thing I had been hoping for: family, present and warm. The gaps grief had torn beginning to knit at the edges. I told myself Robert would be proud. I should have been paying more attention. The first sign was so small I dismissed it instantly. Stephanie sighed when I asked if I could help with dinner one evening. Not an annoyed sigh, or at least that's what I told myself. Just a tired one. People get tired. That's not a sign of anything. Then Nathan handed me a list of house rules. One Sunday morning, cheerfully, with a little laugh that was supposed to make it feel casual. The thermostat was to stay at 68 degrees. The garage door was not to be used after 9 at night. The kitchen was to be cleaned immediately after use, not left until morning. I folded the paper neatly and put it in my purse. "Of course," I said. "No problem at all." But it was a sign, and I knew it was a sign, and I chose not to know. The evening meals changed. Stephanie and Nathan began eating earlier, and then settling onto the couch together, shoulders touching, faces bent toward their phones, while I cleared the table and washed the dishes alone. It was a small exclusion, maybe unintentional. I told myself not to be oversensitive. One night, I got up for water and heard them in the hallway, speaking in the low, urgent voices of people trying not to be overheard. Stephanie's voice first. "I love her, Nathan. But this isn't sustainable. We need our space back." Nathan, quieter I know. "I'll talk to her." I stood very still in the darkened hallway, my hand on the wall for balance. Then I went back to my room, lay down on the bed without turning on the light, and stared at the ceiling. The conversation I had overheard took place on a Thursday. 2 nights later, at the dinner table, Nathan put down his fork. "Mom," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "Stephanie and I have been talking. We think it might be time for you to look for a place of your own." Stephanie was looking at her phone. I remember the precise sensation of that moment, the way the room seemed to shift slightly on its axis, the way my fork felt suddenly very heavy in my hand. I made myself smile. I made my voice come out level. "Of course," I said. "I understand completely." I did the dishes after dinner. I folded the dish towel over the faucet handle. I said goodnight warmly to both of them. I went to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed myself, very quietly, to fall apart. I had raised that boy. I had stayed up with him through fevers and nightmares, and the particular terror of his teenage years. I had worked 2 jobs the year Robert's business, struggled so that Nathan could finish school without taking on debt. I had loved him without conditions or caveats for 38 years, and he had asked me to leave without being able to meet my eyes. That night, I made myself a promise. I was not going to disappear. I was not going to diminish. Whatever came next, I was going to find a way to stand up. I just didn't know yet what standing up was going to look like. I moved out on a Monday morning. I had 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. Nathan helped carry them to the car without saying much. Stephanie didn't come out of the bedroom. The front door clicked shut behind me, with a sound I still hear sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep. I had found a room to rent through an online listing, a boarding house in an older part of Chattanooga, the kind of neighborhood where the houses had good bones but tired faces. The room was small, with a window that looked onto a brick wall, wallpaper peeling at the seams, and a baseboard heater that made a sound like someone clearing their throat every 15 minutes throughout the night. The shared bathroom was down the hall. The kitchen was communal. The other residents were mostly transient people between apartments, between jobs, between chapters. I was 67 years old and I was one of them. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the physical discomfort. I have never been a woman who needed luxury, but because of the silence, the particular silence of a person who has gone from being the center of a household to being a stranger in a hallway, someone people nod at without knowing her name. I applied for work. I had spent most of my adult life running the administrative side of Robert's small manufacturing business, but that work had been invisible in the ways that spousal labor often is not on a resume, not recognized by references, not translatable into the language of job applications. I applied anyway. Receptionist positions, office assistant roles, part-time cashier at a grocery store 3 blocks from the boarding house. The interviews were polite. The rejections were faster. I rationed my savings with the precision of someone who has done that kind of math before, who knows exactly how long a fixed amount of money lasts when stretched carefully. Ramen, canned soup, store-brand coffee. I walked instead of taking the bus when the weather was tolerable. I used the boarding house computer for my job applications rather than paying for internet on my phone. At night, I slept poorly and woke early and lay in the gray pre-dawn light, thinking about what came next. About 3 weeks after I moved in, on a night when the heater was particularly talkative and sleep was particularly elusive, I got up and opened the cardboard box. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just looking for something familiar, a connection to the life I had been living before everything went sideways. I found the photo albums, as expected. Robert's anniversary letter, which I set aside carefully without reading. Nathan's first baseball glove, which I held for a moment and then put back. And then, at the very bottom of the box, a book I did not immediately recognize. It was a journal, small, old, the cover worn to a kind of soft gray that suggested decades of handling. A ribbon marker, faded to the color of old grass. And on the inside cover, in handwriting, I recognized with a shock like cold water my mother's name, Margaret Louise Whitfield, and beneath it, a date 1971. I had not seen this book before. I didn't know it existed. My mother had passed away 11 years earlier, and I had gone through her belongings carefully, or so I thought. Somehow this had ended up in a box of miscellaneous things that had traveled from house to house with me for a decade without being opened. I sat on the edge of my bed and began to read. My mother's handwriting was elegant and slightly old-fashioned. She had learned penmanship in an era when it was taught as a serious skill. The entries were not dated consistently. Some covered days, others seemed to jump weeks at a time. She wrote about her work as a seamstress, about the women whose clothes she altered, and the particular satisfaction of a perfect hem. She wrote about loneliness, and about small pleasures, and about the way certain music made her feel less alone. And then, about 30 pages in, she wrote about a man. She never used his full name in the early entries, only initials, H, B. She wrote about him carefully, with the restraint of someone who knows that what she is recording might be read by the wrong eyes. He was older. He was already established in the world in ways she was not. The relationship was, she wrote, a thing that existed in the spaces between what was permitted and what was not. I read slowly, turning the brittle pages with care. The entries about H.B. continued for almost 2 years. Then they became less frequent and finally stopped. The last entry about him read, "He has arranged everything as he promised. I will not write more here, but E. will not want for anything. I have his word, and the word of the man he has trusted with this. E. My name is Eleanor." I stared at that letter for a long time. Near the back of the journal, pressed between the last page and the back cover, was a folded piece of paper, a name and a phone number in my mother's handwriting. At the top, she had written, "For Eleanor, if she ever needs to know." The name was Martin Aldridge. My hands, I noticed, were shaking. I set the journal on the nightstand beside the lamp. Outside, the night was quiet. The heater was still. I looked at the ceiling of that small, bare room and understood, with a certainty I could not yet explain, that something was about to change. It took me 3 days to make the call, not because I doubted what I had found. The journal, the letter, the initials, they pointed in a direction I could feel even before I had confirmed it. H.B. Howard Bennett. one of the most prominent real estate developers in Chattanooga's post-war history, a man who had built shopping centers and residential neighborhoods, and whose name appeared on plaques and dedications throughout the city. He had passed away in 1998, but his legacy, in more ways than one, had apparently outlasted him. I knew who he was. Anyone who grew up in this part of Tennessee did. What I didn't know, what I was only beginning to understand, was that I was his daughter. I say that plainly now, because plainness is what the situation requires. My mother had a relationship with Howard Bennett in the early 1970s. Their relationship was quiet, private, and constrained by circumstances that people of their generation would understand better than most. She never told my father, the man who raised me, who I loved, and who I believe loved me, who passed when I was in my early 30s. She never told me. What she did was make an arrangement, a quiet, careful, legally binding arrangement, handled by a man named Martin Aldridge, who had worked as Howard Bennett's personal attorney for nearly 30 years. When I called the number in the journal, it was disconnected. The internet, however, is a resourceful tool when you have a name and a city and the particular stubbornness of someone with nothing left to lose. I found Martin Aldridge retired now, in his late 70s, living quietly in a residential neighborhood north of downtown. I wrote him a letter. I explained who I was and who my mother was and what I had found. I asked if we could speak. He called me the following afternoon. "Margaret's daughter," he said when I answered. Not a question, a statement, as if he had been expecting this call for a long time and had decided, somewhere along the way, to simply be ready for it. "Yes," I said. A pause. Then, "How long have you known?" "3 days." Another pause. "I think you should come see me." I took the bus across town the next morning. Martin Aldridge met me at his door, a tall man, thin now, with age, with the careful posture of someone who spent decades in formal settings and never fully left them behind. His home was quiet and orderly. He showed me to a study lined with bookshelves and asked me to sit. He set a manila envelope on the desk between us. "Before I give you this," he said, "I want to explain something about why it has waited this long." He told me that Howard Bennett had set up a trust in 1973. The trust had been designed to pass to his biological daughter. My mother had confirmed the fact of my parentage to Mr. Aldridge directly, in writing, in 1972 upon my mother's death, or upon my reaching out to claim it, whichever came first. My mother's death, 11 years earlier, had technically triggered the transfer, but Mr. Aldridge had been unable to locate me. I had moved several times after Robert's diagnosis, and the contact information on file was outdated. "I tried," he said. He was not defensive about it, simply factual. "I couldn't find you." "I understand," I said. He slid the envelope across the desk. Inside was a letter from Howard Bennett, handwritten, dated 1991, a set of legal documents, and a current accounting of the trust, which had been managed by a fiduciary firm for the past 11 years, accruing quietly. The total value of the trust was $1.4 million. I read the number twice. Then I set the paper down and breathed for a moment. Mr. Aldridge was watching me with the practiced calm of a man who has delivered significant news many times and learned to give people room to receive it. "There's one more thing," he said. When I had been quiet for a moment, he pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the legal summary. "This clause. Your mother requested it specifically, and Mr. Bennett agreed to it." I found the paragraph and read it. "In the event that any direct descendants of the Beneficiary Act to permanently sever the familial relationship defined as abandonment, forced removal, or the deliberate termination of support, those descendants forfeit all claims to the trust or any successor inheritance. The room was very quiet. Nathan had asked me to leave his house. He had done it calmly, at the dinner table, with his wife looking at her phone. He had driven me to my room in the boarding house and helped carry my bags, and said goodbye with the relief of someone setting down something heavy. He had, in a legal and documented sense, severed the familial relationship. And he didn't know it yet. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about what it meant, and what I wanted to do with it, and what kind of person I was going to be in the chapters that followed. I picked up the envelope, folded it carefully, and put it in my purse. "Mr. Aldridge," I said, "I'd like to talk about what comes next. I want to be precise about what I did and what I didn't do, because I think the distinction matters. I did not set out to destroy my son's life. I want to say that plainly, because the story I am about to tell you could easily be misread as a revenge narrative, and it isn't. Revenge is hot and fast and aimed at causing maximum pain. What I did was cool, slow, and aimed at something else entirely, at reclaiming the sense of my own worth that had been quietly eroded over the months since Robert died, and at ensuring that the people, who had treated me as disposable, understood, in concrete terms, that I was not. With Mr. Aldridge's guidance, I structured the inheritance carefully. A quiet LLC Whitfield Property Holdings, established in the state of Tennessee, with me as the sole member. The assets transferred cleanly. The accounts were set up at a bank where I was not known. Nothing flashy, nothing traceable at a casual glance. I bought new clothes, not extravagant, just the clothes of a woman who has her affairs in order. I got my hair cut. I started taking long walks through the neighborhoods I had always admired from a distance, noticing the way good maintenance showed in the details: trim paint, clear gutters, well-kept yards. I began looking at real estate listings, not randomly. I was looking for something specific, and I found it about 6 weeks after my first meeting with Mr. Aldridge. A residential rental property in East Chattanooga, a well-maintained building with 4 units, sitting in the same neighborhood where Nathan and Stephanie lived. In fact, it was the building where Nathan and Stephanie lived. The owner was an older gentleman who had managed the property himself for 20 years and had reached the point where the upkeep was more than he wanted to manage. The taxes were slightly in arrears. 2 of the units needed roof work. He was asking a price that, by any reasonable measure, was below market value. I ran the numbers 3 times. I made an offer. The negotiation took 2 weeks. I was patient. I did not push. I let the seller arrive at the price on his own timeline, which is the only way to buy something at a fair price without creating resentment. When we finally settled on a number, and I wrote the check and watched the deed slide across the closing attorney's desk, I sat very still for a moment. I owned the building where my son lived, not the concept of it. The actual physical structure, the foundation, the walls, the roof, the property on which the whole thing sat. The deed was in my name, or rather in the name of Whitfield Property Holdings, and Nathan had no idea. I did not evict them. I want to be clear about that too. I had no interest in putting my son and his wife on the street. That would have been cruelty, and cruelty was not what I was after. Instead, I hired a property management company to handle all tenant communications. The management company sent out a standard notice to all residents' new ownership, upcoming property improvements, and lease renewals at market-adjusted rates. Nathan and Stephanie's rent increased by slightly more than 3 times what they had been paying. The management company handled all communication. My name appeared nowhere on any document the tenants received. All they knew was that their building had been sold to a holding company and the new rate had taken effect. I heard about Nathan's reaction through the property manager, who called to report that one tenant had called the office multiple times and had become, in the manager's careful phrasing, quite agitated. Nathan had apparently accused the new owners of price gouging and had threatened to report them to the city housing authority. Stephanie had been seen crying in the parking lot on 2 separate occasions. I sat with that information for a long evening. It is a complicated thing to feel the pain of someone you love, and to know that the pain is, in some meaningful sense, a consequence of choices they made. I am a mother. That does not switch off because someone hurts you. The part of me that had sat up with Nathan through earaches and nightmares, and his first real heartbreak at 17, that part still ached when I thought about him, distressed. But there was another part of me, a part that had sat in a rented room with peeling wallpaper and a wheezing heater and rationed soup, because the child she had given everything to had asked her to leave without meeting her eyes. That part watched the situation with a steadiness that surprised me. I was not punishing Nathan. I was simply no longer allowing myself to be worth nothing. There is a difference. It took me most of my life to understand that difference fully. A woman who has spent decades making herself small, accommodating, quiet, careful not to take up too much room, does not arrive at self-worth overnight. It comes back in pieces. A new coat, a walk through a neighborhood you always wanted to live in, your name on a deed. I bought a small house outside the city in early spring, white with dark green shutters, a front porch with 2 chairs, a yard that had been let go a little but had good structure under the neglect. I planted flowers along the front walk, zinnias and black-eyed Susans, the same ones my mother used to grow. Robert would have had opinions about the layout. I could hear his voice suggesting things, and I smiled at it. That spring, I slept well for the first time in over a year. Nathan texted me in early April. "Just a few words, hi Mom. Hope you're doing okay. Wanted to check in." I read it several times before I answered. There was a version of me, the version who had packed 2 suitcases into a car, while Stephanie stayed in the bedroom, who might have had a great deal to say in response to those 9 words, who might have pointed out the irony of checking in after months of silence, who might have asked where this checking-in instinct had been the winter she was eating ramen in a room with peeling wallpaper. But that woman was also the one who had spent decades making herself small to avoid causing friction, and making myself large in a moment of pain was not actually what I wanted. I wrote back I'm doing well. Hope you are too. Nothing more. Nothing less. We texted occasionally after that. Short, careful exchanges, the conversational equivalent of 2 people navigating a hallway after a disagreement, staying close to their respective walls. I did not mention the property. Nathan did not mention having been asked to leave. We were, for a time, 2 people standing on opposite sides of a very wide gap, deciding whether to try to cross it. I spent that spring building my life with an attention to detail I had not given it before. The garden, the house, which I was slowly restoring room by room, new paint in the kitchen, the porch swing I had always wanted and never had. I joined a book club at the local library and found, to my surprise, that I enjoyed arguing about novels with strangers over coffee. I started volunteering 1 morning a week at a senior center a few miles away, helping with the administrative tasks that no one else wanted to do, because administrative tasks were something I knew how to handle. I was very gradually becoming myself again, or perhaps becoming myself for the first time, the version that hadn't been arranged around someone else's needs. Nathan showed up on my porch on a Saturday in late May. No call first, just his car in my driveway, and him standing at my front door, hands in his jacket pockets, looking slightly smaller than I remembered. I had not seen him in person since the morning he helped me carry my bags to the car. I opened the door and looked at him. He looked at me. "Mom," he said. Then he stopped. "Tried again. I need to say something to you." "Come in," I said. We sat in the living room. I made coffee that he held without drinking. He looked at the room around him, the pictures on the walls, the flowers I had just cut and put in a vase, the evidence of a life I had made without his awareness, and something moved in his face. "I didn't know you'd bought a house," he said. "You didn't ask," I said. He nodded. That landed. For a while he didn't say anything. "Then I've been thinking about that night, when I told you when we asked you to find somewhere else." He stopped again. Nathan had always struggled with direct apologies. Robert had been the same way the Whitfield men expressed their feelings obliquely, in actions rather than words. I didn't handle it well. "No," I said. "You didn't." "I know." I waited. "The thing is," he said, "I kept telling myself it was the right decision, that you'd be better off in your own place, that it wasn't good for any of us to be living on top of each other. I had a lot of reasons." He looked down at his coffee. "But the truth is I took the easy way. And I told myself you'd be fine, because it was easier than thinking about whether you actually would be." That was the most honest thing he had said to me in years. Possibly the most honest thing he had ever said to me as an adult. "Thank you for saying that," I said. He looked up. "Are you okay? I mean, really, are you okay? Because Stephanie and the new rent situation, I don't know how it's sustainable. And I was looking online at the ownership records, and the property is held by some LLC, and I can't find out who." I looked at him. Something shifted in his face. A look of slow comprehension, like light coming up gradually, rather than switching on all at once. "Mom," he said slowly. I waited. Is the LLC, are you—" "That's a conversation for another day," I said. He stared at me for a very long moment. Then something happened that I had not seen from him in years. Maybe not since he was a teenager. He laughed. A real laugh. The helpless kind. The kind that comes from the collision of surprise and absurdity, and something that might, with time, become admiration. "Mom," he said again, but differently this time. "I told you," I said, "that I would be okay." We sat together for the rest of the afternoon. The conversation was not the dramatic reconciliation of film's no tears, no declarations, no moment of complete resolution. It was more like the careful beginning of a reconstruction. Two people who had broken something between them, sitting with the pieces, not yet knowing exactly what the rebuilt version would look like, but willing, at least, to try. I did not forgive him that afternoon. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that actually means something, takes longer than an afternoon and requires more than a single honest conversation. But I opened the door, and he stepped through it, and we started. That, I think, is enough for now. I still own the building. Nathan knows. We have not discussed the rent adjustment in detail. That conversation is coming, and I will have it when I'm ready, on my terms and in my time. There are things I want from it that are not financial, a real acknowledgement of what happened, a real reckoning with how I was treated. Those things take time to establish. For now, I sit on my porch in the evenings with a cup of tea and watch the light change over the hills. The zinnias are doing well this year. The porch swing creaks pleasantly. Sometimes I talk to Robert, which is not as strange as it might sound, grief, after enough time, becomes a kind of ongoing conversation rather than a wound. I tell him about the garden, about the book club, about the morning I signed the deed. I imagine him laughing at that last part. Here is what I want you to take from my story, if you take anything at all. You are not too old to begin again. You are not too tired. You are not too small. The world has a long habit of telling women of a certain age that their important chapters are behind them, that they are in the diminuendo. Now, the quiet trailing off at the end of the piece. Don't believe it. I was 67 years old when I sat in a rented room with peeling wallpaper and opened a box of old things and found at the bottom of it a door I didn't know was there. I walked through it, and on the other side was everything I had not yet lived. My name is Eleanor Ruth Whitfield, and I am just getting started.